The courtroom in Jefferson County, Ohio, had a way of making people feel smaller than they already were. The ceilings rose too high, the walls were too pale, and every sound, every cough, every shuffle of paper echoed longer than it should have. On that winter morning, the room was filled with professionals who had learned to keep their emotions neatly folded away. Lawyers in dark suits, social workers with tight expressions, a judge who had seen enough cases to believe very little could still surprise him. And then there was the child. He sat on the long wooden bench, his legs too short to touch the floor, sneakers swinging slightly with each nervous movement. His name was Evan Miller, 3 years old, and he had been brought into the courthouse long before he should have ever known what a courtroom was. A foster mother sat beside him, her posture careful, as if afraid even breathing too loudly might frighten him. Evan clutched a small plastic dinosaur in one hand, its paint chipped from being squeezed too many times. At his feet lay a golden retriever. Most people in the room barely gave the dog a second glance. He was well groomed, wearing a simple blue vest that read "Therapy Dog, Do Not Distract." His name was Buddy, and he rested calmly on the cool tile floor, head down, eyes half-lidded. To anyone unfamiliar with trauma response animals, he looked like he was sleeping. He was. Buddy was watching everything. The case on the docket sounded ordinary to those who process dozens like it every year. Child welfare review, allegations already investigated, prior testimony recorded, medical reports submitted. The court's task, everyone assumed, was procedural: confirm placement, finalize restrictions, move on. No one expected testimony from the child. In fact, it had been made very clear during pretrial discussions that Evan was not to be questioned directly. He had spoken very little since being removed from his previous home. Therapists documented selective mutism, emotional shutdown, and severe anxiety responses to adult male voices. His statements, such as they were, had been indirect, through play, through drawings, through long silences that professionals tried to interpret without pushing too hard. That was why Buddy was there. Buddy had entered Evan's life 6 months earlier, assigned through a nonprofit program that paired trauma-affected children with trained therapy dogs. The first meeting had been cautious. Evan hadn't wanted to look at Buddy at all, but Buddy had known better than to rush. He lay down several feet away, turned his head slightly, and waited. By the third session, Evan had reached out. Now in the courtroom, Buddy lay closer than usual, his shoulder nearly touching Evan's shoe. The judge, Harold Whitman, adjusted his glasses and scanned the room. He had presided over family court cases for nearly 20 years. He believed in structure, in evidence, in process. He also believed that emotions, especially sympathy, could cloud judgment. Children were vulnerable, yes, but courts could not operate on feelings alone. "Let's proceed," Judge Whitman said evenly. The prosecutor stood and began reviewing the timeline. Names were spoken, dates repeated, locations referenced. Evan did not look up. His gaze stayed fixed on the floor, his grip on the dinosaur tightening with each minute. Buddy's ears twitched. When the name of the previous caregiver was mentioned, Buddy's breathing changed, slow, deliberate, controlled. His tail stopped moving entirely. He did not growl. He did not bark. He simply opened his eyes and watched. The foster mother noticed. She had been trained to watch Evan's cues, small changes in posture, sudden stillness, the way his fingers sometimes locked as if bracing for something invisible. She saw Evan's shoulders pull inward now, his back rounding slightly. She felt him lean, just barely, toward Buddy. She said nothing. Across the room, the defense attorney shifted in his chair, confident. The evidence against his client had always been thin. No direct statements, no eyewitnesses, no physical proof strong enough to stand alone. He had prepared for this hearing as a formality, already anticipating a favorable outcome. The prosecutor continued, voice neutral, professional. The child was removed from the residence on May 14th following a welfare check. Evan's sneaker stopped swinging. Buddy lifted his head. It was a small movement, easily missed, but Judge Whitman noticed it. He had grown accustomed to reading rooms, to sensing when something was off. The dog's posture had changed, not dramatically, but with intent. His body angled slightly toward Evan, as if forming a barrier without standing. Interesting, the judge thought. The prosecutor finished her summary and took her seat. The judge glanced at his notes. Everything on paper pointed toward closure. The system liked closure. It liked neat endings. "Before we conclude," Judge Whitman said, "is there anything further?" The defense attorney shook his head. The prosecutor hesitated. "Your Honor, I understand the court's position, but given the child's condition, I'd like to request that the therapy animal remain present throughout any further proceedings." Granted, the judge thought, no harm in that. "Approved," he said. Evan shifted. For the first time since entering the room, he looked up, not at the judge, not at the lawyers, but at Buddy. His eyes were wide, searching, as if checking whether Buddy was still real. Buddy met his gaze and did something he hadn't done all morning. He leaned in and gently rested his chin on Evan's shoe. Evan's breathing slowed. The courtroom moved on, unaware that something fundamental had already begun to change. Reports would be refiled, statements reviewed. The gavel would eventually fall. But beneath the surface, beneath procedure and precedent, something fragile was stirring. A truth that had been too heavy for a 3-year-old to carry alone. And a dog who had been trained to recognize the moment when silence could no longer protect someone. No one in that courtroom knew it yet. But before the day was over, the smallest voice in the room would reshape everything they thought they understood about the case, and about justice itself. Buddy had not always been calm. Years before he ever wore a blue therapy vest or stepped inside a courtroom, Buddy had been just another number in a county shelter in Missouri. He arrived thin, ribs showing, fur matted, ears scarred from old injuries no one bothered to document. The shelter workers noted his behavior carefully. Non-aggressive, hyper-alert, unusually sensitive to raised voices. He flinched at sudden movements. He avoided men who stood too close. Most people saw weakness. The trainer who eventually chose him saw something else. Buddy wasn't broken, he was listening. During training, Buddy proved different from the other dogs. While others focused on commands, Buddy focused on people. He noticed breathing patterns, heart rate changes, the way hands clenched before voices cracked. Trainers discovered he could detect emotional distress long before humans recognized it. He wasn't reactive, he was anticipatory. That was why he was assigned to children like Evan. Evan Miller's file had been thick for someone so small. Pages of observations, assessments, and cautious language filled with phrases like nonverbal response, withdrawal, and avoidance behaviors. What the paperwork couldn't capture was the emptiness behind Evan's eyes when he first arrived in foster care. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He didn't ask for anyone. That worried the therapists more than any outburst would have. At 3 years old, Evan should have been noisy, demanding, impulsive. Instead, he moved like someone trying not to be noticed. He walked softly. He flinched when doors closed too loudly. When adults spoke too quickly, he folded inward as if making himself smaller could make the world safer. Words had abandoned him, or perhaps he had abandoned them. No one knew for sure. The first therapy session with Buddy had been conducted in a brightly lit room filled with toys meant to invite play. Evan sat on the floor, back against the wall, staring at nothing in particular. Buddy entered slowly, led by his handler, then stopped several feet away and lay down. He didn't approach. He didn't wag. He waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Evan never looked at him. But Buddy never looked away. By the end of that first session, Evan hadn't spoken. But when it was time to leave, his hand brushed Buddy's tail, so lightly it could have been accidental. Buddy's handler smiled. That was enough. Over the next weeks, Evan spoke only to Buddy, not in sentences, not even in full words. Sometimes it was a sound. Sometimes just a breath shaped like it wanted to be a word but couldn't finish forming. Buddy responded to all of it. Now, months later in the courtroom, those same instincts were fully awake. Buddy sensed the shift long before anyone else did. When the defense attorney crossed his legs sharply, Buddy noticed Evan's shoulders tense. When a man in the back row cleared his throat, Evan's fingers tightened around the dinosaur until the plastic bent slightly. Buddy moved closer, inch by inch, offering silent reassurance. The judge saw a well-trained dog. Buddy felt a child bracing for something he didn't understand how to survive. The prosecutor continued speaking, reviewing documents already familiar to everyone present. Her voice was steady, professional, but it carried a cadence Evan recognized. It reminded him of voices that asked questions without wanting answers, voices that spoke about him instead of to him. Evan's breathing shortened. Buddy's ears tilted backward. The foster mother noticed Evan's foot tapping, fast, uneven. That was new. She gently placed her hand near him but didn't touch. She had learned that sudden contact sometimes made things worse. Buddy shifted position and pressed his side against Evan's shin. Evan leaned into him. A murmur rippled faintly through the courtroom. Someone whispered about the dog being unusually close. Another person frowned, distracted. Judge Whitman noticed again. He leaned back slightly in his chair, watching not the lawyers, but the child. He had seen children lie before. He had seen them coached, pressured, confused. But he had also seen something else over the years. Children who went quiet not because they didn't know the truth, but because the truth felt dangerous. Evan looked like one of those children. "Your Honor," the defense attorney said, standing again, "given the lack of direct testimony, we respectfully request." Buddy rose to a seated position. It wasn't sudden, it wasn't disruptive, but it was intentional. Evan's dinosaur slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a soft clatter. The sound echoed far louder than it should have. Evan froze. For a split second, his eyes darted toward the defense table. Buddy followed his gaze instantly. The handler shifted uncomfortably, sensing something was wrong. Buddy was trained not to interfere unless necessary, but he was clearly fighting the instinct to do more. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Is something the matter?" "No, Your Honor," the defense attorney said quickly, "just continuing my request." But the judge wasn't listening anymore. He watched Evan's chest rise and fall too quickly. He saw the child's lips part slightly, then close again. He saw Buddy inch forward, placing himself directly between Evan and the defense table. That wasn't random. That was protection. Judge Whitman cleared his throat. "We'll proceed carefully," he said. "There's no need to rush." The words were meant for the courtroom. Buddy took them as permission. He lowered his head and gently nudged Evan's knee once, a signal Evan recognized from therapy sessions. "You're safe. I'm here." Evan swallowed. Something stirred behind his eyes. For months, adults had asked him to remember things he desperately wanted to forget. They asked him to explain feelings he didn't have words for. Every time he tried, his chest tightened, his throat locked, and silence rushed in like a wall. But Buddy never asked. Buddy only listened. Now, in the middle of a room full of strangers, Evan felt something unfamiliar rising. Pressure, fear, and beneath it all, a fragile urge to be understood. His lips trembled. Buddy didn't move away. Across the room, the judge slowly raised his hand. "Counsel," he said, voice calm but firm, "I want to pause here." The courtroom stilled. Evan took a shaky breath. Something was about to happen. Something no report, no document, no adult testimony could control. And Buddy knew it. The air in the courtroom had grown heavier, though no one could pinpoint why. Lawyers shuffled papers quietly, pens tapping nervously against their notebooks. Even the stenographer paused mid-stroke, as if waiting for a sign that wasn't coming. Every adult in the room felt a subtle shift, though most dismissed it as pretrial nerves. Only Buddy and Evan noticed the difference fully. Buddy's golden eyes tracked every movement. He could sense Evan's pulse quicken before the child even realized it himself. His ears twitched, his muscles tensed, and the faint, barely perceptible whine escaped him, one he reserved only for moments of genuine danger or distress. Evan, seated stiffly on the bench, buried his small hands in his lap, gripping his dinosaur like a lifeline. His little knuckles whitened, and for the first time that day, he didn't glance at Buddy's face for reassurance. The foster mother leaned forward slightly, careful not to invade Evan's personal space. She had learned to recognize the signs: rapid blinking, shallow breaths, the slight tremor of the chin. He was terrified. She knew this, and yet she also knew that the world demanded he answer. The courtroom demanded words he hadn't been ready to say for months. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses and studied the child. He was no stranger to seeing 3-year-olds in court, though usually those cases involved custody disagreements, not allegations of abuse. Even so, he had learned over the years that children were incredibly honest, but only when they felt safe. Evan had clearly been denied that sense of safety before, and now, seated among strangers in the formal structure of a courtroom, the child was perched on the edge of something no one could anticipate. "Counsel," the judge said carefully, "we may need to ask the child some questions." His voice was calm, neutral, but firm. "I want to emphasize we are not seeking anything he cannot say. No pressure." The prosecutor nodded, though inwardly her stomach twisted. She knew how fragile Evan's silence was. She knew that asking him questions, however carefully, risked triggering panic, withdrawal, or worse. But this was the final hearing. This was the moment when the facts would meet the law. The defense attorney, on the other hand, remained confident. The child had never spoken before, and he did not expect anything different now. "Your Honor," he said, voice measured, "I submit the child cannot provide direct testimony. Any questioning is irrelevant." But Judge Whitman waved him off. "We will proceed cautiously. Please be ready to halt immediately if there is distress." Buddy reacted instantly. He shifted closer to Evan, pressing his side against the child's legs. It was subtle but deliberate, a shield. Evan's fingers, previously curled tightly around the dinosaur, relaxed slightly against the dog's fur. His little frame still trembled, but he now had a tether to something living, breathing, and entirely loyal. The prosecutor crouched down slightly, speaking softly. "Evan, can you tell us about your toy?" she asked. It was a benign question, too simple really to provoke fear, but Evan flinched. He blinked rapidly and shook his head. Buddy nudged him again with his nose, low and soft, the message clear: "You can trust me. You are safe." Evan's head lifted slightly. He glanced at Buddy, then back at the floor. Something in him wanted to speak, wanted to be heard, but years of silence had built a dam inside him. Minutes passed. The adults around him grew restless. Lawyers whispered, flipping through notes. The foster mother tried not to fidget. Judge Whitman, however, remained patient, watching closely. He understood the stakes. In family and abuse cases, 3-year-olds rarely spoke, and when they did, it could either shatter a case or save a life. Buddy sat upright. It was the first time he had broken his calm, reclined posture in the courtroom. His eyes stayed locked on Evan. The faint whine grew louder, low and insistent. The child's fingers dug into Buddy's fur. He trembled, rocking slightly, a quiet, nervous rhythm that only the dog could interpret. The judge adjusted his glasses again, leaning forward. "If the child is ready to speak, he may. Otherwise, we will pause." Evan's lips parted. The room fell silent, as though even the air held its breath. Everyone noticed, not consciously perhaps, but instinctively, that something extraordinary was about to happen. The court reporter paused, pen hovering. Lawyers straightened, uncertain whether to intervene. Buddy's fur rippled slightly under the child's grip. His ears twitched toward the sound of the defense attorney shuffling papers. Evan's small voice trembled as he inhaled, not enough to be heard by everyone but enough to catch Buddy's attention. Buddy leaned closer, placing his head lightly against Evan's knee, grounding him. A few adults noticed the gesture and exchanged puzzled glances, but none spoke. They couldn't. The moment belonged to Evan. He exhaled, small and shaky. His tiny shoulders lifted as he whispered, "He hurt." The room went still. Pens paused mid-stroke. The stenographer stared at the machine. Lawyers' mouths opened slightly, then closed. The defense attorney froze, face paling. Even Judge Whitman's gavel seemed to hover midair, suspended between procedure and disbelief. Buddy reacted immediately, rising and positioning himself fully between Evan and the rest of the courtroom. His low, protective growl was not threatening, but it carried an unmistakable warning. "Do not come closer." Evan buried his face into Buddy's fur, drawing courage from the dog's steadfast presence. The foster mother covered her mouth. Tears threatened to fall, but she forced them back. She had seen Evan speak before in therapy sessions, but never like this, never in front of strangers who could make or break his life. Those two words, simple and raw, were more than just a statement. They were a bridge across years of silence, a signal that he was ready to be heard. Judge Whitman struck the gavel lightly, not to restore order but to signal pause. "All right," he said softly, "we will proceed carefully. No further questions until we confirm the child is safe." The courtroom staff exchanged whispered comments. "Did he just—" one murmur started. "Yes," another replied, "he spoke." Buddy remained alert, his gaze unwavering, as if challenging anyone to doubt the significance of those words. They were more than a sentence, they were proof. Proof that the child's fear had been real, that the allegations weren't fabricated, and that someone had been harmed. The prosecutor, regaining composure, motioned for a trauma specialist to address the court. Within moments, a professional entered and explained Buddy's reaction. The dog's posture, low growl, and positioning were all consistent with trained responses to genuine distress. Adults had tried to interpret Evan's silence for months, but the dog had understood instinctively. It became clear that the child had been trying to communicate for a long time, but words had been trapped by fear. Buddy, however, knew what was true. He had waited. And now Evan had found the courage to speak, just enough to confirm what had always been suspected. The defense attorney sputtered, grasping at the thin air of procedure. He attempted to downplay the statement, insisting that 3 words or 2 couldn't dictate a legal ruling. But Judge Whitman, seasoned and experienced, knew better. He had seen how trauma presented in children. He had seen how subtle cues, tiny gestures, fleeting expressions could reveal more than 1,000 words. And in that moment, the dog had spoken too. Buddy's presence had validated Evan's courage. Without him, the child might have remained silent. Without Evan's words, the courtroom would have remained blind to a truth too important to ignore. The room was no longer just a courtroom. It was a witness to trust, to instinct, to a bond between a small child and a dog that understood him more than anyone else ever could. Judge Whitman took a deep breath, placing his hands lightly on the bench. "Let's take a brief recess," he said, "and ensure the child and his dog are comfortable. We will continue with extreme care." Evan exhaled, the tension in his tiny body slowly uncoiling. Buddy nuzzled his face once, silently affirming, "It's okay. You did it." For the first time in months, Evan felt a spark of power, a small, fragile sense that his voice, even in 2 tiny words, could change the world around him. Outside the courtroom, reporters, lawyers, and staff would later recall that moment with awe. It was subtle, it was quiet, but it was undeniable. In the most ordinary courtroom in the county, a child and a dog had spoken a language adults could barely understand, and it had been enough. No one could have predicted what would happen next. The wheels of justice had slowed to a crawl, waiting for the truth to catch up with the courage of the smallest voice in the room. And everyone, even those who didn't yet realize it, would be changed forever. The courtroom had never been quieter. Papers lay untouched, chairs scraped silently across the polished floor, and the judge's gavel hung in midair, not striking but suspended, as if the universe itself had paused. All attention had shifted to one small figure seated on the bench. 3-year-old Evan Miller, his body curled slightly against Buddy's golden side, had just spoken. 2 words. That was all. "They hurt," he had whispered. No one in the room could ignore them. The words were simple, childlike in their utterance, yet heavy with truth. Every adult present felt the weight immediately. The accusation, the confirmation, the raw vulnerability of a voice that had been silent far too long. Papers fluttered in nervous hands. Even the stenographer paused mid-stroke, unsure if she should record or simply breathe. Buddy reacted instantly. His head lifted, ears pricked, and he positioned himself squarely between Evan and the rest of the courtroom. It was a subtle movement for some, but to those trained to recognize animal behavior, it was profound. Buddy was signaling danger, not imagined, not routine, but real, present threat. His body language screamed protection. A low, guttural hum emerged from his chest, barely audible yet potent enough to make anyone near him pause. The foster mother's face drained of color, her hand flying to her mouth. Tears threatened to spill. She had witnessed Evan's silences for months, weeks even, when he refused to speak during therapy, when his drawings told the story his lips could not. And now, for the first time in months, she realized that the boy's tiny voice had broken through the barrier of fear, and the dog had confirmed every hidden truth the adults had missed. Judge Whitman leaned forward in his seat, one hand hovering over the gavel. He had presided over countless abuse and custody hearings, seen children traumatized beyond words, and yet this moment struck him differently. He had witnessed a convergence of instinct and courage, the kind rarely observed in a structured courtroom. He recognized that the smallest voice in the room, the 3-year-old boy, was commanding the attention of everyone present, amplified not by volume, but by meaning. The defense attorney froze. For years, he had relied on procedure, on documents, on witness statements carefully crafted to support his client's narrative. He had never anticipated this. The child's words, uttered in their fragile simplicity, struck directly at the heart of the case. And the dog's behavior, that defied every argument he had planned. Buddy's positioning, his sudden alertness, and the low warning hum could not be ignored. Any claim that Evan's statement was coached or fabricated had just collapsed under the weight of instinct. The prosecutor's voice trembled slightly as she motioned for a trauma specialist to approach the bench. Within moments, a professional entered, offering a calm explanation. "Your Honor," she said, voice steady but urgent, "Buddy is trained to detect acute emotional stress. His response here is consistent with a child experiencing real, present trauma. This is not coincidental behavior. The dog's positioning and reactions are deliberate signals that the child feels threatened and confirms the validity of his statement." The courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. People who had been confident or indifferent now realized they were witnessing more than legal procedure. They were watching instinct, loyalty, and truth unfold in real time. Every paper, every testimony, every document suddenly seemed secondary to the moment occurring between a small child and his golden retriever. Evan, meanwhile, clung to Buddy's fur. His chest rose and fell in rapid, uneven breaths, and his wide eyes darted nervously across the room. For months, he had been silent because speaking meant exposure, vulnerability, but Buddy's presence had given him the courage he never thought he could summon. The child felt the warmth, the reassurance, and the unwavering protection of a being trained to sense fear, to anchor him, to ensure he survived this moment unscathed. Judge Whitman spoke softly, his tone measured but authoritative. "Let's pause proceedings briefly," he said. "Everyone remain seated. Ensure the child and his dog are comfortable. No questions will continue until I confirm it is safe." The foster mother exhaled a shaky breath, her hand still hovering near Evan. She had been trained for crisis management, but nothing could have prepared her for the gravity of this moment. Evan had spoken, and the meaning of those two words, "he hurt," resonated far beyond the simple accusation. It encapsulated months of fear, avoidance, and silent suffering. Buddy's body remained a barrier between Evan and the rest of the courtroom. His head pressed against the child's knees. His eyes never left the source of the perceived threat. When the defense attorney moved slightly, Buddy's ears flicked, a warning signal that did not go unnoticed by the judge. This was no ordinary courtroom dog. Buddy had become, in that moment, a silent witness, a guardian, and a living confirmation of the child's truth. The courtroom staff whispered among themselves. A few reporters glanced at each other, sensing that something extraordinary was happening. It was subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible, but undeniable. The system had relied on documents and procedural motions for months. Now, instinct and courage had rewritten the narrative. The trauma specialist continued, offering calm explanations. Dogs trained for emotional support can detect micro-expressions, heart rate changes, and subtle fear responses. Buddy's behavior is textbook for a child experiencing acute distress. If we are to interpret these signs properly, this court must take Evan's statement seriously. For a long moment, no one spoke. The gravity of the situation settled over the room like a heavy fog. Pens hovered over notebooks, lawyers' hands paused mid-motion, and the judge studied the small figure clutching a toy and leaning against a golden retriever. It was a picture of vulnerability, but also of courage, for the child had found the strength to speak through years of imposed silence. The foster mother finally knelt slightly beside Evan, careful not to touch him too suddenly. "It's okay, Evan," she whispered. "You're safe, you're okay." Buddy's ears flicked, a subtle affirmation of the same message. The child exhaled, a shaky breath escaping lips that had refused words for too long. He lifted his head slightly and looked directly at the judge. For a fleeting moment, his wide brown eyes held everyone's attention, demanding acknowledgement, demanding protection, demanding truth. Judge Whitman, a man who had seen the harshest corners of human behavior, felt a lump rise in his throat. He had spent years navigating cold, procedural justice. He had seen children fail to speak, families crumble, and systems falter. But here, in front of him, something pure had emerged, a child's voice, fragile and tentative, amplified by the unwavering instinct of a loyal dog. He nodded once, imperceptibly, signaling both acknowledgement and readiness to act. No words were needed. The room understood this was not a procedural pause. This was a reckoning. The defense attorney finally found his voice, but it trembled. "Your Honor, may we, Judge Whitman raised a hand. "All right, we proceed carefully. No further questioning until we determine this child is fully ready, and until then the dog remains here." Buddy, as if acknowledging the decision, lowered his head once more but remained alert. His tail twitched slightly, a subtle signal of reassurance to Evan. The child's fingers tightened around the dinosaur again, but this time the grip was less of fear and more of grounding. Evan exhaled again, small and controlled, feeling a measure of strength for the first time in months. The two words had left him, simple yet profound, and the dog's reaction had magnified their meaning for everyone in the room. It was a quiet revolution in that courtroom. Justice, often slow and procedural, had been interrupted by instinct and courage, and the adults present, lawyers, social workers, and even the judge himself, recognized that what they were witnessing would be remembered for years, not because of legal arguments or paperwork, but because of two tiny words and one loyal dog who understood them better than anyone. Outside the formal structure, the air remained still. Inside, the course of the case had shifted irreversibly. The child had spoken. The dog had reacted. And the room, once ordinary, now held a moment of truth that no procedure could erase. Judge Whitman tapped the gavel lightly. "We will reconvene after a short recess," he said, softer than usual. "Ensure the child is calm. The dog remains beside him, and let us take the time to consider what has just occurred. Buddy rested his head against Evan's knees once more, the faint hum of his protective growl fading into a low, steady presence. Evan's eyes, still wide, met the dog. For the first time, he felt a sense of empowerment, small, fragile, but real. And in that still, frozen moment, the courtroom understood something fundamental. Sometimes, justice doesn't come from loud arguments, meticulous reports, or rehearsed testimony. Sometimes it comes from 2 words spoken by a terrified child and a dog who knows exactly when to listen. The courtroom had emptied slightly for recess, but the atmosphere remained heavy with tension. Lawyers whispered in low voices, flipping through their notes frantically. Journalists crowded near the doors, exchanging murmurs about the extraordinary events they had just witnessed. For a moment, no one wanted to break the silence, as if speaking aloud might undo the fragile balance of truth that had just appeared in front of them. At the center of it all sat Evan, small and trembling, leaning against Buddy. The golden retriever rested his head on the child's knees, still alert, still poised to respond to the slightest hint of danger. His soft whines had faded into a low hum, signaling to everyone who cared to watch that the boy was safe, for now. Evan clutched his toy dinosaur with one hand while the other rested on Buddy's back. A trauma specialist was called forward to testify and interpret the dog's behavior. Her name was Dr. Lillian Hayes, a veteran in child psychology and animal-assisted therapy. She approached cautiously, recognizing that this courtroom had just witnessed something extraordinary. She knelt to Evan's level first, giving him a reassuring smile. "Evan," she said softly, "you're safe here. Buddy is with you and I'm here to help." Evan nodded, still silent, still absorbing the comfort of Buddy's presence. Dr. Hayes stood and addressed the courtroom. "Your Honor," she said, voice calm and deliberate, "what has just occurred is a textbook example of trauma-based communication. Buddy is trained to detect microexpressions, subtle changes in breathing, muscle tension, and even involuntary movements that indicate fear or distress. His response to the child's reaction is not coincidence. It confirms that the child experienced an acute emotional event when certain subjects were mentioned. Buddy's positioning and protective behavior provide us with nonverbal confirmation of Evan's statement." The judge leaned forward, studying Dr. Hayes intently. "So you are saying the dog's behavior validates what the child expressed?" Dr. Hayes nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. The dog has essentially acted as a witness to the child's emotional truth. The child has had difficulty verbalizing trauma, as is common at this age, but Buddy's responses allow us to interpret his feelings accurately. These subtle, instinctive cues tell us the child was speaking honestly when he said he hurt." Across the courtroom, murmurs spread. Lawyers consulted their notes. Even the defense attorney, who had been confident moments ago, now looked uncertain. He had relied on silence, on documentation, on absence of testimony. He had not accounted for a dog trained to perceive danger, nor a child who had finally spoken after months of fear. The judge's gaze returned to Evan. The boy remained quiet but attentive, his small fingers pressed into Buddy's fur. He looked up briefly at Judge Whitman, then at the trauma specialist, as if silently asking whether he had done something right. "You've been very brave," Dr. Hayes said softly, "and Buddy has been helping you stay safe while you spoke. That's very important." Buddy's tail gave a slight wag at her words, a quiet acknowledgement of understanding. The judge exhaled, his demeanor changing subtly. He had seen many cases in his career, but the combination of instinct, loyalty, and human courage in this room was unique. He realized that the procedural documents he relied on were insufficient. This was no longer about papers and prior testimony. It was about a living, breathing child conveying truth in the only way he knew how, validated by a creature trained to understand fear. "Counsel," Judge Whitman said, his voice steady, "I am requesting that the court take this into account. Further investigation is required before we proceed. We will not continue questioning the child until we ensure his safety, both physically and emotionally. The presence of the therapy dog remains approved." The prosecutor nodded solemnly. "Understood, Your Honor. We will request additional motions and review prior reports in light of this new context." The defense attorney, pale and stiff, nodded mutely, unable to form a response. For once, procedure and law had met instinct and truth, and instinct had won. Buddy shifted slightly, nudging Evan's leg with his nose, silently encouraging him to remain calm. Evan exhaled, the tension in his small frame slowly easing. For months, he had carried a heavy burden alone. Now he had spoken and the room had listened, both to his words and to the signals Buddy provided. Outside the immediate courtroom, social workers and law enforcement officers were quietly conferring. They reviewed the timeline of events and noticed patterns in prior reports that had previously seemed inconclusive. Now, in the context of the child's words and Buddy's responses, inconsistencies were impossible to ignore. Minor details, dates, locations, interactions, took on new significance. The child's 2 words had triggered a reevaluation of the entire case. The foster mother stayed close to Evan, her hand lightly resting on Buddy's back. "You're okay," she whispered again. Evan nodded, his lips pressed tightly together, and for the first time that morning he looked up at her with the faintest hint of a smile. The bond between the boy and the dog had not just given him courage, it had provided the bridge for him to be heard. Dr. Hayes continued her explanation for the courtroom, her voice soft but authoritative. "It's important to understand that Buddy's reactions are not just supportive, they are informative. The child's behavior in relation to the dog, combined with the child's verbal statement, creates a scenario where the court can reasonably conclude that the child is reporting a real event." The judge's gaze swept the room. Lawyers, social workers, and officers understood the implications. They could no longer rely solely on documents. They needed to observe, to interpret, to acknowledge the nonverbal truth that Buddy was revealing. Minutes passed in tense silence. Even the stenographer remained unusually still. Buddy rested his head again, eyes glancing toward Evan, as if to reassure him that he was not alone. Evan leaned into Buddy's warmth, small hands gripping fur, his tiny body trembling less now. The judge exhaled and tapped the gavel lightly. "We will reconvene shortly with further guidance. The child's statement and the dog's behavior will be formally noted in the record. All parties are expected to respect the child's comfort and the evidence these 2 provide." Outside the courtroom, officers began reviewing surveillance footage, prior reports, and past witness statements. They noticed small inconsistencies and anomalies that now demanded attention. The child's words, interpreted through Buddy's actions, had turned what was once considered routine into a high-priority investigation. Inside the courtroom, Evan finally exhaled deeply. Buddy pressed closer, offering reassurance without words. The foster mother whispered softly, repeating the only words that could matter now. "You are safe. You are brave. You are seen." For a small moment, the courtroom was no longer a place of procedure. It had become a stage for truth, instinct, and courage, a reminder that sometimes justice relies not just on human interpretation, but on the subtle, loyal, and intelligent instincts of a dog who understands far more than he is asked to. And for Evan, those few moments, backed by Buddy's unwavering presence, would mark the beginning of a shift. His voice, so long silenced, had been acknowledged. His pain, once invisible on paper, now carried weight. And everyone in that room, from the judge to the attorneys to the social workers, would remember that the truth sometimes comes in whispers, validated by those who do not speak at all. As the court prepared for the next phase of proceedings, one thing was undeniable. Buddy had revealed more than a dog ever could, and Evan's courage had reshaped the course of the case. 2 words, spoken softly by a 3-year-old, had set a chain reaction in motion that would challenge assumptions, demand attention, and ultimately change lives. Outside the courtroom doors, sunlight reflected off the courthouse windows. Inside, the tension had not dissipated, but the momentum had shifted. The child and his dog had spoken, the adults had listened, and for the first time in a long while, the system was beginning to respond, not just to procedure but to truth itself. And in that moment, Buddy rested, ever watchful, a silent hero in a courtroom that would never forget him, or the small boy whose voice he had helped release. The courtroom reconvened after the brief recess, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. Papers rustled nervously in the hands of lawyers, pens hovered uncertainly above notebooks, and even the judge's usual stern demeanor softened with careful attention. Something fundamental had changed. A 3-year-old child and his golden retriever had rewritten the rules of engagement in a courtroom that had been procedural, sterile, and predictable only hours earlier. Evan sat slightly taller now, though his small frame still trembled. Buddy rested at his feet, but he was not calm. His ears were pricked, eyes scanning the room, body taut with vigilance. Every movement was deliberate, a silent warning to anyone who might harm the child or even attempt to intimidate him. The foster mother kept her hand lightly on Evan's back, grounding him, but she knew that the real anchor was the dog. Buddy had become more than a therapy animal. He was now a silent witness, a protector, and a living validation of Evan's courage. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses and addressed the courtroom. Given the new information, including the child's statement and the dog's documented responses, I am issuing an immediate protective order. The words were calm but carried immense weight. All parties must comply immediately, and the court will reassess custody, visitation, and any ongoing investigation in light of these developments. The defense attorney's face turned pale. He stammered, "Your Honor, there must be procedures this order." Judge Whitman raised a hand. "This is not a matter for debate at this moment. The child's safety comes first. We will revisit legal arguments once the child and witness protections are in place." Evan clutched Buddy's fur tighter. The dog nudged him gently, reassuring him. Even in the face of sudden, dramatic changes, Buddy remained a steady anchor. Evan exhaled, letting the tension ease slightly, knowing the judge had acted to protect him. The courtroom staff exchanged glances. Social workers quietly prepared updated case notes. Law enforcement officers consulted each other in low voices. The child's 2 words, uttered softly just hours ago, had triggered an immediate response that altered the trajectory of the entire case. What had been a routine review of foster placement and past allegations was now a high-priority investigation. Dr. Lillian Hayes, the trauma specialist, returned to the bench to explain the significance of Buddy's role in ensuring Evan's safety. "Your Honor," she said, "Buddy's behavior indicates acute awareness of potential threats. His protective stance is not learned aggression. It is a trained response to perceived danger, combined with instinctive recognition of the child's emotional state. The child's cooperation and ability to respond appropriately is entirely linked to Buddy's presence." Buddy's tail twitched slightly in acknowledgement. Evan looked down at him, understanding the silent communication. "I am here. You are safe." The prosecutor rose, her voice steady but firm. "Your Honor, given the child's statement and the dog's corroborating behavior, we request that the court immediately re-examine prior witness statements, timelines, and any discrepancies. We must ensure that no detail is overlooked in light of this validated testimony." The judge nodded. "Agreed. Court records will be re-examined and all relevant parties notified. Additional witnesses may be called to corroborate the child's statement and support the investigation." Across the courtroom, the defense attorney muttered under his breath, his confidence eroding rapidly. The child who had been silent, the dog who had been passive, and the court itself, once procedural and predictable, had combined forces to expose gaps in the narrative the defense had relied on for months. Buddy remained alert, never leaving Evan's side. When a court officer approached the child, the dog subtly shifted, placing his shoulder between Evan and the adult. His soft growl was audible, deliberate, and unmistakable, a signal that no one could ignore. Evan exhaled, reassured by the dog's presence, his small body slowly relaxing into the protective shadow of Buddy's fur. The foster mother whispered softly, "You're doing great, Evan. You're safe. We've got you." The words were gentle but purposeful. Buddy pressed his head against the child's knee, reinforcing the message without interrupting the proceedings. Judge Whitman leaned forward, speaking slowly and deliberately. Let it be noted in the record, the child's statements, combined with the dog's behavior, represent a significant indication of trauma and potential harm. Protective measures are not optional, they are immediate. The court recognizes that the dog's trained responses are instrumental in validating the child's testimony and ensuring ongoing safety. Outside the immediate courtroom, the ripple effect of this decision was profound. Law enforcement officers began reviewing case files with renewed urgency. Minor discrepancies in dates and witness statements, previously dismissed as inconsequential, now took on new importance. The child's words, combined with Buddy's instinctive reactions, had forced a re-examination of evidence that might have been overlooked otherwise. Inside the courtroom, Evan leaned against Buddy, his breathing slowing. The child's small body, once tense and guarded, now exhibited subtle signs of relief. Buddy's presence had given him a newfound sense of control over an environment that had previously felt overwhelmingly threatening. In that moment, the child and dog were inseparable, not just companions, but partners in ensuring that truth and safety prevailed. The foster mother's hand remained lightly on Evan's back, grounding him, but it was Buddy who truly kept him calm. Every subtle movement of the dog, every low hum, every protective shift signaled to Evan that the world outside their small bubble could be navigated safely. The judge tapped the gavel lightly. "We will proceed with caution. Protective orders are in place, and the child's testimony, such as it exists, will guide the court's actions moving forward. Buddy's presence is acknowledged as critical to the child's well-being and ability to engage with the court process." Evan exhaled again, pressing his small face into Buddy's fur. The dog nudged him softly, reinforcing the reassurance. The room, once procedural and formal, had become a stage for instinct, courage, and the quiet power of trust. The prosecutor and Dr. Hayes quietly reviewed next steps with law enforcement officers. Additional interviews were planned. Statements were to be cross-referenced. The child's words had ignited a chain reaction. What had been routine was now a high-priority case, one that would demand careful attention and meticulous handling. Evan sat quietly, still gripping Buddy's fur, absorbing the shift. For months, his voice had been trapped in silence. Fear had kept words from forming, and adults had misunderstood him. But now, validated by both the dog and the court, he felt the fragile beginnings of empowerment. 2 words had changed everything. Buddy's ears twitched at every sound. The faintest shift in movement from the defense table made him rise slightly, ready to shield Evan again. The dog was vigilant, unwavering, and wholly loyal. Evan's small hand rested on Buddy's back, and for the first time he felt that he might survive this moment without fear. The judge exhaled and looked at the attorneys. "Let this be a reminder to all. The court's primary responsibility is the safety and well-being of the child. In this case, that responsibility includes acknowledgement of nonverbal cues and instinctual behavior of trained support animals. Proceed with extreme caution and care." Outside the courtroom, reporters captured snippets of proceedings, unaware of the full significance but sensing the extraordinary nature of the events. Inside, the child and his dog had quietly upended expectations, forcing the adult world to reconsider everything they thought they knew about fear, courage, and truth. Buddy rested his head once more on Evan's knees, his body tense but reassuring. Evan exhaled, gripping the dog tightly. Together, they had faced the first wave of chaos, and together they were ready for whatever came next. And in that courtroom, something subtle yet undeniable had happened. The system had begun to bend in response to instinct, loyalty, and the fragile bravery of a small child who had finally spoken. The courtroom had taken on a weight that was almost tangible. Every eye in the room seemed to flick between Evan and Buddy, watching, waiting, sensing that something extraordinary had already taken place, and that more was coming. The protective orders had been issued. The trauma specialist had confirmed the dog's role in validating the child's words, and law enforcement officers had begun reviewing every detail with renewed intensity. Yet the tension was far from over. The next step, witness testimony, would determine how far Evan's courage and Buddy's instincts would ripple through the proceedings. Witnesses began filing in, each one carrying small but critical pieces of the puzzle. The first was Mrs. Langley, a neighbor who had seen signs of irregularity in Evan's previous home but had never spoken up. She fidgeted nervously as she approached the stand. Her hands trembled slightly, and she avoided direct eye contact with the defense attorney. Buddy's ears twitched. He shifted slightly, his body aligning between Evan and the witness. Evan clutched the dog tighter, drawing courage from his presence. "Good morning, Mrs. Langley," Judge Whitman said. "Please describe what you observed in the Miller household prior to the child's removal." Mrs. Langley swallowed, glancing toward Evan briefly before continuing. I noticed the child seemed afraid of the man in the home. He would hide sometimes when the man entered the room. I didn't know what to do at first. I thought maybe he was shy, but it was constant. Day after day, I could see it." Buddy's ears twitched, and he let out a low hum, almost inaudible, but Evan felt it as a grounding presence. The foster mother whispered softly, "Good job, Evan. You're safe." The words mingled with Buddy's reassurance, creating a safe bubble around the boy. Across the courtroom, the defense attorney shifted uncomfortably. He had anticipated witnesses who would downplay incidents, who would follow a script he could challenge. This was different. The witness was corroborating the child's subtle signs of fear, signs Buddy had been trained to recognize instinctively. Next came a former caregiver, Mr. Delgado, who had interacted with Evan prior to foster placement. His testimony added layers of confirmation. "The child rarely spoke," he admitted, "but I noticed he would tense up or flinch when certain people approached. It wasn't verbal, but it was obvious to anyone paying attention." Buddy lifted his head slightly, ears pricked. He nudged Evan gently with his nose. The child's fingers gripped the dog's fur, and for the first time since entering the courtroom that morning, his shoulders relaxed slightly. The dog's presence gave him permission to believe that his truth mattered. The courtroom murmured. Even Judge Whitman felt the unusual weight of instinct paired with testimony. Witnesses were speaking, yes, but the dog had already anticipated, validated, and protected. The court could now see the convergence of instinct and fact. Dr. Hayes took the stand again, providing a more detailed explanation. "Your Honor, Buddy's presence is more than supportive. His responses are measurable indicators of trauma. In cases like this, nonverbal validation from a trained animal is often more reliable than verbal statements alone, especially with children who experience selective mutism or trauma-induced silence." The defense attorney coughed nervously, flipping through notes, searching for inconsistencies. But the combined weight of child, dog, and corroborating witnesses left very little room for doubt. Every account pointed toward the same reality. Evan had been harmed, had feared for his safety, and had communicated that fear as soon as he could. Buddy had provided the missing link, the validation of instinct, of truth, of courage. As the morning wore on, more witnesses came forward. A teacher described Evan's sudden withdrawal from classmates before entering foster care. A social worker spoke of minor physical signs the child displayed during previous visits. Each testimony layered onto the narrative, reinforcing the truth Evan had quietly spoken. And every time a witness approached, Buddy subtly repositioned himself, ensuring the child felt safe and signaling the court to pay attention. The courtroom atmosphere grew charged, almost electric. People leaned forward, whispers quieted, pens paused. It was as if everyone, judges, attorneys, social workers, were holding their collective breath, recognizing the gravity of what was unfolding. A small child who had once been voiceless now had witnesses confirming the reality of his experiences. And a dog, silent yet instinctively communicative, had made sure that courage was possible. Evan remained seated, gripping Buddy's fur, occasionally exhaling through small, shuddering breaths. Each wave of testimony reinforced a sense of empowerment. He had spoken, he had been heard, and now others were confirming his truth. For months he had carried a weight no 3-year-old should bear. Now, step by step, the courtroom recognized that weight and began to share it. Judge Whitman adjusted his glasses and looked around. It is clear to the court that the child's statements, combined with corroborative witness accounts and the dog's trained responses, provide a substantive basis for concern. Protective measures remain in effect, and the court will now deliberate on next steps regarding custody, visitation, and ongoing investigations. Buddy nudged Evan once gently, and the child exhaled, a small smile forming for the first time. The bond between them was undeniable. Buddy's instincts had guided Evan's courage, and Evan's voice had validated Buddy's presence. Together, they had changed the dynamic of the courtroom. Outside, reporters typed furiously, capturing the extraordinary combination of child courage and canine instinct. Social workers filed notes for months of follow-up. Law enforcement officers reviewed timelines and previously overlooked reports. The ripple effect was massive, all stemming from a 3-year-old's whispered words and a golden retriever's unwavering vigilance. The foster mother watched her small charge, marveling at his resilience. She had seen glimpses of bravery before, but nothing like this. The child had found a voice, and with Buddy by his side, he had communicated more than words alone could ever express. Judge Whitman tapped the gavel lightly. The court recognizes the child's courage, the dog's contribution, and the corroborative evidence provided today. We will continue proceedings with a full acknowledgement of these factors. Buddy lowered his head onto Evan's lap again, exhaling softly. The child stroked his fur, letting the dog absorb his tension. In that quiet connection, both boy and animal knew they had faced a critical turning point. The defense attorney looked defeated, realizing that no amount of procedural argument could erase what had been witnessed. The child had spoken, witnesses had confirmed, and the dog had provided undeniable validation. The scales of the courtroom had tipped decisively toward truth and safety. Judge Whitman exhaled and leaned back. Let the record reflect that this child, with the assistance of a therapy dog, has provided the court with insight into events that were previously obscured. All parties are instructed to proceed accordingly. Evan exhaled, leaning further against Buddy. The dog rested his head on the boy's knees, alert but calm. The courtroom had borne witness to a rare and extraordinary event, instinct, courage, and truth converging to ensure that justice could finally be served. For the first time since the case began, there was hope. The child's voice had been heard. The dog's instincts had guided that voice to safety. And the adults in the room, judges, attorneys, social workers, and officers, had been forced to acknowledge that the most profound truths are sometimes communicated not by words alone, but by trust, instinct, and unwavering loyalty. Outside the courtroom doors, the world waited. Inside, a small child and his dog had rewritten the story of fear, courage, and justice, and nothing would ever be the same again. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet intensity as everyone waited for Judge Whitman to deliver the final ruling. The past several hours had been extraordinary. Witnesses had spoken, timelines had been examined, protective measures had been put into place, and most importantly, Evan's voice had been heard, albeit in 2 small, fragile words. Buddy, ever vigilant, lay at the boy's feet, his golden head resting lightly on Evan's knees, ears alert to every movement, body tense yet protective. The judge cleared his throat, drawing the room's full attention. Today, this court has witnessed something remarkable, he began, voice steady and calm. A child, small in size but immeasurable in courage, has spoken the truth, and in doing so has relied upon a companion whose loyalty, training, and instinct have revealed the reality of that truth. This court acknowledges both the words of the child and the actions of the dog in reaching the following decisions. Evan's small hand instinctively stroked Buddy's fur, feeling warmth and reassurance. For months, he had feared speaking aloud. Fear had silenced him. Now, validated by Buddy and the court, he felt the fragile stirrings of empowerment. He had never imagined that his two words could reshape an entire proceeding, but they had. Judge Whitman continued. First, all protective orders currently in effect will remain in place. Second, custody of Evan will remain with his foster family, who have demonstrated commitment and care, until further notice. Third, all previous allegations of abuse will be reinvestigated, taking into account the corroborative witness statements and the nonverbal validations provided by the dog. The child's well-being is paramount, and all proceedings must reflect this priority. A hush fell over the courtroom. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, realizing the case had slipped irreversibly out of his control. No procedural loophole could negate the courage of a 3-year-old or the instincts of a golden retriever trained to recognize fear. The prosecutor, face still pale from the intensity of the morning, exhaled. "Your Honor, the child's safety is our first concern," she said, voice firm, "and we will continue to assist the court in any way necessary." Judge Whitman nodded once, then turned his attention to the child. "Evan, you've been very brave today. Your words and actions have helped the court understand important truths. The adults here are listening, and we will continue to protect you. You have done very well." Evan blinked, his wide brown eyes glistening. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Buddy pressed his head against his legs, nudging him gently, affirming that he was safe. The child exhaled, small and shaky, and pressed a little closer to the dog. In that quiet moment, the bond between them was undeniable. Buddy had not only protected him physically, but had guided him to find courage he didn't know he had. Outside the courtroom, the ripple effect of the proceedings began immediately. Social workers, law enforcement officers, and child advocates began implementing new protocols based on the extraordinary case. Children in foster care would now have the potential for emotional support animals to assist them during proceedings. Buddy's role had set a precedent, a living example that instinct, loyalty, and courage could reveal truths adults might otherwise miss. Within the courtroom, reporters jotted notes feverishly. Every word, every gesture, every small interaction between Evan and Buddy was documented. The story of the 3-year-old and his dog would soon reach headlines far beyond the courthouse walls, a tale of bravery, trust, and the unique bond between a child and his loyal companion. Evan's foster mother bent down, whispering softly to him, "You did it, Evan. You were so brave. Buddy helped you and everyone listened. You're safe now." Buddy, sensing her reassurance, wagged his tail gently, nuzzling Evan once more. The child's fingers brushed along the dog's golden fur, tracing the familiar lines that had been a lifeline for months. The small movements spoke volumes: gratitude, relief, and a quiet understanding that some bonds were unbreakable. Judge Whitman addressed the room one final time. "Let this court reflect on the extraordinary courage displayed today. Let it be a reminder that the smallest voices, when heard and protected, can affect profound change. And let the role of this trained animal be formally recognized for its contribution to the well-being of the child and the integrity of these proceedings." As the gavel fell, signaling the formal conclusion, a sense of calm settled over the room. The tension that had gripped everyone for hours slowly released. Attorneys packed up their files, witnesses whispered their final remarks, and social workers coordinated the next steps for Evan's ongoing care. Yet even as the formal proceedings ended, one truth remained clear. Buddy's presence had been indispensable, and Evan's voice, fragile though it had been, had carried the power to change everything. Outside the courtroom doors, sunlight poured into the hall. Evan emerged, Buddy faithfully at his side. He looked up at the sky for a moment, then at the foster mother who had guided him through every step of the process. His small smile grew slightly as Buddy nudged him, a silent reminder that the world was no longer as frightening as it had once seemed. Months later, Evan and Buddy's story would inspire countless others. Child advocacy groups would reference the case as a landmark example of animal-assisted support in trauma recovery. Legal experts would discuss the unprecedented validation of a child's nonverbal cues in formal proceedings. And most importantly, Evan himself would continue to grow, knowing that his voice, however small, mattered, and that Buddy would always be there to help him find it. At home, Buddy remained vigilant but relaxed. Evan ran and played with him in the backyard, laughter spilling freely for the first time in what felt like forever. Every wag of Buddy's tail, every gentle nudge, reinforced the bond that had carried them through the courtroom, through fear, through uncertainty, through every silent moment when words failed. The foster mother watched them, marveling at the resilience and bravery of both boy and dog. "You saved him, Buddy," she whispered, bending down to stroke his golden fur. Buddy barked softly, nuzzling Evan's hand in response, as if to say, "We saved each other." In the years to come, the case would be cited in legal journals, child advocacy manuals, and stories of courage around the country. But for Evan, it was simpler. Buddy was more than a dog. He was a friend, a protector, and the key that had unlocked the courage to speak. And for Buddy, Evan was more than a child in need of care. He was the one he had been trained to protect, the one whose small voice had finally been heard. Justice had been served, yes, but more importantly, truth had been recognized, courage had been validated, and an unbreakable bond had been forged. As the sun set over the courthouse, Evan leaned against Buddy, small fingers tracing the familiar golden fur. The world no longer seemed so vast, so dangerous. He had spoken, been heard, and was safe. And through it all, one constant remained, a loyal companion who understood fear, courage, and love in a way no words ever could. Buddy lifted his head, letting out a soft, satisfied sigh, and Evan smiled. Together they had weathered fear, uncertainty, and silence. Together they had changed the course of a courtroom and ultimately a life. And in that quiet, golden moment, it was clear. The truest acts of bravery are not always loud. They are the whispers of courage, the steadfast presence of loyalty, and the unbreakable bond between a child and a dog who refuses to let him face the world alone.